Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and today's episode is very interesting because it is not a follow-up, not a throwback, but it is a connected episode to my previous one with Damien Bloss. I am here with his wife to speak about the loved one side of addiction and recovery. So, a couple weeks ago, I had an episode with Mr. Bloss on breaking the silence, and the highlight of that conversation was after 20 years of addiction, he recovered. So, the message was one of hope that is never too late. But during all that time, there's a lot that goes on, especially behind the scenes, and it can affect friends, family, co-workers. And interestingly enough, when you're in that position, especially of someone close, like a spouse, a husband, a wife, or a mother, father, sister, sometimes we're the last person to realize it, and sometimes we're the first to pick up on it. So it can work out very interestingly. But we are here with Mr. Bloss's wife, Alicia. Great to have you here. And like I said beforehand, we started recording here. So glad to have you coming on and sharing your side of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, my name is Alicia. I am the wife of an alcoholic. I truly, truly appreciate you inviting me to be on the show. Like I said, it's very unusual for anyone to, or people to really want to hear our side of the story. It doesn't matter if it's a spouse or a child or cousin or family or just a friend. Nobody ever wants to hear our side of the story, because it's about the addict. It's about the person that's going through it. What they've overcome. So when I get to be asked to do things like this or speak about what I've been through with it, it's a huge honor. It really is, because I don't get to do it often.
Right. And I definitely know that a lot of addicts prefer to work with and hear from people who are addicted themselves as well. But
Right.
I'll tell you, as someone who still has an addicted father and who hosts a show working with individuals who have been addicted or work with individuals in addiction recovery, I've definitely learned a lot along the way. And I think it's important for addicts in recovery or active use to kind of also hear. I know they're not always receptive to it, especially when they're actively using, but I think once you recover, part of the 12 steps, or even if you're not doing the 12-step program, is making amends with people. And so hearing and realizing the amount of damage you did to them, whether it was physically, emotionally, financially, which oftentimes it's all three. And I think it's so important to hear that, especially I know for me, the financial aspect always got me as a kid, seeing how much money my father spent on alcohol that could have gone to us, that could have gone to these things that the family needed. And it's I think it's interesting how people who are financially hurt will still be addicts, and addiction is one of the most expensive things that can happen to a person.
Yeah, yeah, no, it absolutely can. So we've been together for 15 years now, and the first 10 of those years he was in active addiction, and the first 10 of those years I supported the family. We have three kids and the two of us, and it's not easy in this economy, especially nowadays. Like, I don't know what would
Right.
happen if he was still doing it, but back then it was difficult. I had a decent job, but it wasn't enough to survive on my own. I don't know how I made it to survive with five of us. It was extremely difficult. His money was his money. He would help if he could, but I knew that it was almost pointless for me to even try to get anything out of him, because he would make excuses as to, oh no, I didn't get paid this or this much this week, or I had this bill to pay, and I knew darn well that he didn't, because I took care of everything. So his money legitimately just went to the liquor store. And for years, when I so we do share a bank account, but obviously, we have our own account. So he would use the money out of his own account for his
Right.
alcohol. But I would, log into his bank account, and I would look and see what when he's been to the liquor store. There were 4 times in a day that he would
Wow.
go. And if I confronted him, I knew it was just a flat lie. It was, oh no, it just takes a while for the pending to go away or whatever. And I think honestly, I think that probably lasted about 2 or 3 years before I just gave up. I was like, I'm not, there's no point in arguing. You're a grown man. I'm not raising another child. This isn't my fourth kid. So, you do what you got to do. I couldn't, at that point, I was like, I just can't do it anymore. When we bought our house, we have to get bank statements and stuff like that. And he was terrified to hand over his bank statements because he knew the
Mm,
amount of times that was going to be showing on there. And, obviously I looked at them, but I'm like, these people, they're not going to judge you. I might,
yeah.
but they're not. So the financial aspect, it was very, very rough for us for those first 10 years. 10 years is a long time to deal with something like
Yeah.
that. And I still don't know how I did it, but I did because I had to. That's how I felt at the time.
I know my father's excuse was always, why buy the cheap vodka? And I'm like, but it's still a bottle a day. And if you do the math
Oh
over the
yeah.
course of, I
Yep.
mean, he's been drinking since he was like 12 or 13. But
Yep.
I know at least for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, it was a bottle of vodka every day, plus all the little
Yep.
airplane bottles that, especially once he tried hiding his addiction, a lot of airplane bottles, which just add up, like you said, every
Yep.
day adding up. You mentioned 4 times in a single day. I mean, even if that was $10, $20 a trip, a couple times a week, it adds up fast. And yeah, so you mentioned lying as well, which I know one thing my father liked to do, which he still does, but more so when he's actively drinking. He's currently on the roller coaster of sober, unsober for the past 6 years now, where he has his phases, and depending on where he's at, he'll do a thing called withholding the truth does not equal lying. And I know there was a lot of times where my
Correct.
mom would ask him if he was drinking or text him and say, "Are you drinking?" And he wouldn't answer. And he took that as being integrable and not lying. Um, or do kind of partial truths. Like he would always try to make it seem like he wasn't lying, but especially by just not answering or redirecting. Is that something that you experienced at all?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. There was a lot of partial truths. There was a lot of, oh yeah, I've only had two drinks. When you watch like Cops or Live PD or something, and they're always pulling people over. Oh no, I've only had two drinks. Yep, that was my husband. It was more the partial truths when it came to the drinking, because he knew that I knew him better than anybody ever did. I could see it in his eyes. It wasn't just, the of course a smell. You have certain smells even today. It
Right.
still triggers me with certain smells. You can clearly smell alcohol, and he would try to hide it in raspberry tea, and put raspberry vodka in raspberry tea. I'm like, you can still smell it. But it was the partial truths of, yes, I have, but I've only had two. And I couldn't get him to understand that, I know you don't act like this when it's only two. Clearly it's been all day. You have the look in your eyes. He always had different, his eyes would look different. He wouldn't look at you even if you weren't asking him, a direct question about the drinking, just having a conversation with him, he wouldn't look at you.
Mm,
So I'm like, I know that you're doing it. So if you're lying to me about this or your partial truth, what else
what
then
else?
would you be lying about?
Yeah.
So it was a lot of trust that was broken, but the trust wasn't broken right away. The trust actually took a couple of years for me to give in, I guess. Like I wanted to trust him. I wanted to believe him.
Right.
But after so many years of dealing with it, one little thing, all the trust was gone. It literally would take just coming home from work and see that he's, completely wasted. And I would ask him, no, I'm not. It was in that instant, all of the trust was gone. So it took a while for that to go away. And I am, to be honest, like I'm not a very trustworthy person to begin with. My entire life has been built around people that have just used me or lied to me.
Right.
So when you're with somebody that, you're supposed to spend the rest of your life with, you're supposed to trust them. So he's the first person in my life I ever trusted. And I think that's why it took so long for that to go away. Because I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that all of his partial truths were full truth. I wanted to believe that, he wasn't going to lie, that he wasn't going to steal, that, he wasn't going to spend all of our money, that he wasn't going out and doing whatever the heck it is that he wanted to do whenever he wanted to. I wanted to believe that he wasn't that person. And it took many years for that to go away, but it also has taken many years for that to come back.
I think you kind of hinted at something that a lot of us fall into, which is almost a state of denial. You know, you don't want to
Mm,
believe what you know is being lied to you about because, you know, this is supposed to be my husband or my father or my mother. And I think it's so important for people to know that like even we want to believe that these people are good, but that addiction is a strong thing that people break moral boundaries for
yeah,
addiction. They do a lot of bad stuff for addiction. I
yeah.
mean, I've hosted people who they were burying bottles in the backyard to hide their drinking. I have people who
Hmm.
have lied about, a lot of things. I remember one time I had to take alcohol away from my dad, and he almost physically attacked me because he was so addicted, because they become very reliant on it. So I think it's a state of denial because you don't want to see a person you love and care about be
Right.
in such a state, especially when it comes to the physical symptoms. When you start seeing that,
Hmm.
it's like I don't want to believe this is what they've become. I know the first
Hmm.
time like mentally and emotionally, the drinking had taken its toll on my father for many years, and I was used to it. But I hadn't seen him in a few years, and when I saw him, and he had lost like 100 pounds, he was down to that alcoholic skinny look and always cold. And when I saw him, that I mean, I couldn't help but cry because like that was like the physical confirmation, because
Hmm.
the personality kind of like I said goes in phases, it comes and it
Yeah.
goes, and this and that when I saw the physical toll of alcoholism on my father, I mean, that was the hard proof right there. There was no way he could look like that and not be an alcoholic. And it was so sad to me because he used to make fun of people. We would drive around, he would say, "Look how skinny that guy is, and look at his calves. He must be an alcoholic." And then he became
Hmm.
that, and it was so heartbreaking to see a man who was strong,
Mm.
full of vigor, and muscular and
Hmm.
tall and handsome, just waste away. So it's hard, and to see your husband who comes home from work and is clearly drinking, and now you're like, was he drinking all day on the job? And you don't want to believe that he would take that risk and endanger your family financially. So
Hmm.
I get it. I think a lot of us get into denial, and we need to realize sooner rather than later that addiction causes people to change.
Oh, it definitely causes people to change. When we first got together, we met through a friend, a mutual friend, and so I had heard stories. We had met, I guess, 3 years before we actually started dating, and we knew of each other, hung out, at bars and stuff like that, but I didn't really know him. So when we first started dating, the mutual friend, kind of gave me a little bit of a backstory, and she was like, just so you know, he does drink a lot. Like he's had some major issues with it. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's not that bad, that's what everybody says. People used to call me an alcoholic all the time, but I technically wasn't. I loved to drink back then. So hearing the stories and then, getting together, building this life together, and like you said, slowly watching him just fade away. When I was pregnant with our youngest, is when I realized that he was hiding the alcohol. He would say, "Oh no, I found it in the back of the fridge." I'm like, "You didn't find it in the back of the fridge. Like I know what's in there. There's not much in there because you're spending all my money, so there's not much in the fridge." But that was when when I first started noticing that he was hiding it. And then over the years is when he would hide the vodka bottles on his car. And then like I can gradually, like I can look back at my Facebook pictures and I can pinpoint each issue that we had at that time in our life. And you can see him slowly, like you said, withering away. The look in his eyes was gone. His eyes were sunken. He's not a big guy. He's tall, but he's like really skinny. But like his stomach was getting bigger. But that was the only thing on him that was getting bigger. He was
Right.
swollen all the time. He wasn't taking care of himself. I guess it was pretty much like I had a fourth child. And this is the man that, I fell in love with, the man that promised me that, he was going to be there for me through everything and we were going to do this life together. And that man was gone. The only man looking at me at that point 5 years ago was the alcoholic. My husband was gone. It literally took him, the alcoholism literally took him from me. And at one point, I guess it was about 2 years before he got sober, somebody had asked me, well, if it's really that bad, why don't you leave? And without hesitation, I looked at them and I said, well, because everybody else gave up on him. And if I give up on him, what's that going to do? When I, I've been divorced. I know what that's like. It's not like you can't, I'm not the type of person that's going to say, oh no, you have to leave this person. It's your only way out. If that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. But with this marriage, I was like, this is what I need. This is what he needs. If I give up on him, I am no better than everybody else that has been in his life that has given up, that has watched him do this and has not been there to actually help him because I knew he was still in there. The physical changes were drastic. It did take the 10 years and you don't notice it at the time. It's when you go back and you look at those pictures or like you said, you don't see them for a couple of years and you're like, oh my God, who is this person? That is what this disease does to them. And it makes them legitimately believe that this is their only option in life and it's their only friend and it's the only thing that cares about them. And that's where he was in those last 2 years, was that nobody cared. Everybody hated him. The alcohol was his only friend. That's the only thing that was going to make him feel better. So it's very difficult to go back and look at those pictures to see the change in him because it still hurts. It still hurts both of us. I had to go through and delete a bunch of them because he didn't want me to have them on my Facebook page anymore. But there are some that I've kept because I'm like, this is, if you ever have these feelings again, these are what I'm going to start showing you. This is what you
Right.
looked like at this point.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely rough to watch anybody. And I have, when you have kids and when you have, your parents or whatever, your brother, sister, your blood family, in a way you're kind of almost like, I don't want to say forced to love them, but they're your blood. That's just, you automatically love your children. You automatically love your parents. And, even though your parent might be an addict or whatever the case may be, you still love them. You might not like them, but you still love them and you still want the best for them. When it's your partner, every day you have to choose that. I don't
Mm.
have to be here. I don't have to be with him. I didn't have to deal with it. I
Right.
chose. So to choose to love somebody that's doing that to themselves is extremely difficult because I had to wake up every day and look at him and be like, I still love you. I'm not sure why today, but I still do. So I can't imagine either it being like a family, blood family.
Yeah. With I resonate with what you said about the only person left because my mom, my sisters, everyone gave up on my dad except
Yeah.
for me. And a lot of people said, "Well, why don't you just leave him too?" And part of like you said, and I've discussed before on shows, like a lot of alcoholics and drug users, they don't have any hope in themselves or belief in themselves. They have a lot of what's the point mentality. And
Mm-hmm.
so I said, if I give up on my dad, he's gonna have to really look for that reason to live by himself and for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he definitely needs to find that either way. But you know, you talked about loving family regardless, and for a long time in my life, that was played out wrong. As in, I loved my father even though he was a dad. Therefore, I let him get away with a lot of stuff. And later in life,
Mm-hmm.
I learned to set boundaries and
Yeah.
still love and care about him, but not give
Mm-hmm.
in to his addiction or the destructive habits of it,
Mm-hmm.
which has been very difficult. Like this past recent Thanksgiving, I actually had to leave him because he was just too far gone and intoxicated.
Mm-hmm.
And it hurt. It hurt to feel like I was abandoning my father. He ran down very drunken down the street after my car. Like that was like a horrible sight to see.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also a wake up call for him, and he
Right.
sobered up, and I got to spend Christmas with him. So there is a love to be had, and there's a tough love, and there's a love with boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and respect. But there's also, too much love where you're enabling their habits or letting
Right.
them, walk all over you. And so I've had a lot of trouble finding the balance of that. And so I really speak to all the individuals of addicted loved ones, to find that
Mm-hmm.
balance. And you know what? I know I talked on a addiction recovery podcast about, that acknowledgement, especially when they recover, because I know some people never will accept you back into their lives even after you recover
Mm-hmm.
because you did so much damage. But I think even as one of those hurt people, acknowledging their sobriety and saying, "Hey, I'm not letting you back into my life because of all that's happened, but I do respect and I am proud of you for getting sober and for making this decision, and I hope it goes well
Mm-hmm.
for you." Just that acknowledgement can mean a lot because it's not
Yep.
easy getting sober. And I know, like I was sharing with you before we started recording, my neighbor is 80 years old and he's been sober for 45 years and he lives alone and none of his family talks to him and they
Mm-hmm.
never like really I feel like appreciate it. I know he did some damage to them for sure, but I think it's like in his life, he could easily say, "What was the point of getting sober? Just
Mm-hmm.
to be alone, to have no one." So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to be there for those who recover and are in recovery because they often don't have anyone. Like you said,
Mm-hmm.
I've had my father say, "Son, I love vodka more than you." And I think sometimes he thinks that vodka loves him more than me.
Mm-hmm.
But I've learned to be able to express and show my love while still taking care of him and myself. So how did you find that balance, if at all, with your relationship with your husband? Like you said, for you, it was even more difficult because you, other than marriage and divorce and the kids and everything, at the end of the day, like you said, you could leave. I don't want to say it's not your problem, but at the end of the day, you could say to hell with all of it and cut your ties. So, what kept you going besides he needs me? Like what? Because 10 years is a long time to go through all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to like I honestly don't know. I was I spent many years lying to our family, lying to my dad. My dad and I are very close. I lied to my mom. My mom and I were not very close, but I, lied to her, lied to our friends. I lied to my in-laws, and I would tell everybody, "Oh no, Damien's fine," because I didn't want anybody to look at him differently. And in a way, I was
Right.
embarrassed. I was embarrassed because deep down, I knew that I didn't deserve to be married to an alcoholic. Nobody deserves any of that. Nobody deserves to become an addict. But I felt at the same time, I felt like I was being punished for some reason. I felt like, well, I'm, such a horrible person. This is my fault that he's doing this, so I owe
Mm,
him. I felt like, it was my basically my karma because that's kind of how I lived my whole life, always being told that everything was my fault.
mm,
And it wasn't up until like the last 4 years that I have finally gotten to the point where I'm like, right, it's not my fault. None of this is my fault. Nothing that the person 30 years ago that I knew, or it wasn't my fault that my mom was this way, or it wasn't my fault that my friends were this way, and it wasn't my fault that he was the addict. But for 10 years, I blamed myself. And I still, even now after 5.5 years, I still will catch myself thinking about that. It's if he drinks tomorrow, that's going to be my fault.
Mm.
If he drinks 5 years from now, it's going to be my fault. I don't think I ever, and I don't think I will ever get to that point where, I am mentally free and clear from all of it
Yeah.
because it was, it was 10 years worth. But I felt like because I thought that it was my fault, and I was embarrassed that, this is what our life was. And I felt like in a way that I owed it to him because when we first started dating, everything's all hunky dory when you first meet
Yeah,
somebody
of
and,
course.
you go through that honeymoon phase and all that stuff. But he saved my life. He mentally saved my life. I, I was going through the motions of my life at the time, and I was separated, and I wasn't mentally doing well myself. And then he came along and was this person that had never been there for me before. So I felt like because he saved my life, I felt like I owed him that as well. And that has also taken me years to realize that I did not owe him anything. That, I stayed and I did it because the man that I married was still in there somewhere. I knew he was. And, there's sober Damien, who is amazing. And then there's drunk Damien, who nobody wanted to be around. And I'm very, very grateful that I did stick around, that I didn't stay because of the kids. So many marriages, they last, 30, 40 years and they're like, stayed because of the kids. And that's no way to live your life
No, not at all.
either. Not at all. And, we've always, even before when he was drinking, we always did try to put our marriage first, not each other. Damien is not my number one. My kids are my number one, but our marriage comes before all of that because at the end of the day, when the kids are all grown and out of the house, I don't want to look across the kitchen table and be like, who the hell is this guy? I don't know who you
Mm.
are. So specifically, since we both got sober, we put the marriage first. If there are issues, we now can talk about them. Um, yeah, so it's kind of, it's still building on the 10 years that we lost.
Right. And I definitely agree. I know a lot of people who stay together, quote, for the kids, they end up like
Yeah.
traumatizing their kids. They end up having
Mm-hmm.
a toxic relationship, a bad marriage, and it's
Mm-hmm.
bad parenting. It's just all around bad for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
including, the marriage partners as well. So I definitely agree with that sentiment. And I will say, well, I'll focus in first. Speaking of the kids, I mean, did you have to tell them like, hey, dad's an alcoholic? Or they kind of knew like what? I mean, not sure what their ages were and how that kind of played into all of this. Because you talk about a 10-year period. So like,
Yeah.
how do you have that conversation with your children?
So the older two understood. They were, oh my God, how old were they? Maybe 14 and 10, 14, 11, somewhere around there. Early teens, preteens. The youngest, I think she was only maybe 4, or I think she was like 5 at the time when he went to rehab. So the older two understood. They they had their own ways of dealing with it, but the youngest didn't understand anything. She still, to this day, she's 13. She still doesn't really get it. She just thinks, oh, daddy used to be fun. Daddy's not fun anymore because daddy's not drinking anymore. I'm like, well, he's an alcoholic, like this is what it is. And now that she's at the age where she's like understanding, going through the drugs and the alcohol at the school and
Yeah.
everything like
Yeah.
that, she kind of gets it. But back then, daddy's just at a hotel for a month. That's where he was.
Mm.
The older two, they dealt with it fine because I think they realized he's finally getting help. It wasn't, I think I held so much back from the kids as well that I don't think that they realized just how bad he was because I was always there to protect them. I was always there to
Okay.
take care of them.
Right.
So, like, they knew, but except for now, we'll talk about it now and, they'll start remembering certain things. But I held so much from them as well. I protected them as much as I could that sometimes I think that actually caused more damage
Mm.
than not because, you know, they they don't it's not like I want them to see their dad in a different light. It's that, I want them to understand that this is what addiction does to you, and addiction clearly runs in our family. So, this is what you would have to, not worry about. Like, I don't want anybody to worry about it, but this is what you have to, have in the back of your mind.
Right.
And so, yeah, so I think I did. I think I protected them a little too much, especially the little
Mm.
one. Because, like I said, she's 13 and she really, to this day, she just doesn't understand. She knows what it is, but she doesn't understand.
Yeah. So I know for my family, me and my younger sisters, or at least my one of my sisters, we were in high school and post high school. My father's alcoholism really took off. So we had times where we were just with him and saw his behavior. And like going back to the very beginning of the episode, you talked about knowing when he was drinking or not. So with my father, I could tell by the way he was texting. There was a certain style of texting that was only when he was drinking, on top of certain ways he would talk, certain words he would use. It's so funny because my father would not realize this, and he would be so dumbfounded on how we knew he was drinking because he's like
Yeah.
done everything he can to hide the physical evidence, but then he's texting me in what I call hieroglyphics. Um, I can tell when there's random capital casing and words are all
Yeah.
spelt wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and there's just a certain. The more he drinks, the less coherent his text would get. So there would be a certain way. Also, just like the style of how many he would send, right? So that was one clear way for us. But yeah, I'll say my mom definitely tried to protect us to some degree, but I think we were older and exposed a lot more to
Yeah.
it. But we were also more old enough to, understand it as not like drinking because when you look at I can understand your youngest child when you look at advertisements, it's like, oh, the party doesn't start till people are drinking. When people drink, now it's a party. People are having fun, they're laughing and joking. So when you say dad drinks too much, you just hear, oh, he's having a great time.
He's having a
But
great time.
no, some people turn into villains when they drink, especially when you get into addiction and the effects are a little different compared to when you're just drinking socially. And so one thing I want to talk about is focusing on modern day. Has enough time passed where you feel like sobriety is secure, or do you feel like you're still walking on eggshells sometimes, like this could come back at any minute? Like, do you live in constant fear and anxiety? And if so, how are you like kind of coping and combating that?
I mean, I live in constant fear and anxiety about everything. So, let's just add one more thing to the list on days. That's fine. But with this, I don't walk on eggshells as much anymore. There are over the last 5 years, we've talked a lot about, he has his triggers. And I hate using that word. It's one of my biggest pet peeves, but it's true. He has his triggers and I have mine. And there are certain things, movements that he might even make, or, you know, my biggest one, I've talked to a lot of people that are in my position, and one of my very best friends, her mom was an alcoholic and she died from alcoholism like a year or so ago, that one of our biggest things would be a Coke can opening. When you hear the sound of
Mm,
the can opening, that is a huge, for some reason, it's still to this day get me
Like
to
irks
like
you.
go like
Yeah.
this. And I'm like, what is he doing? I have had to learn to trust. I have had to learn to accept. I have also had to learn literally everything all over again, just as much as he would have to, or any person in his position. You have to learn how to live all over again. And I've had to learn how to do that as well. So while there are certain things that will still get me scared, get me fearful or triggered or whatever the word you want to use it, if now I can go to him and I can say, I don't like that. This reminds me of when this happened. Can we not do that anymore? And 6 years ago, he would have gotten extremely upset about it. But now I can actually say that and he'd say, oh, I am so sorry. I didn't realize that that was, an issue. I'll try to remind myself not to do that again. And I have to do the same thing. There might be times I might say or do something that might, get him to a certain point, mentally or whatever, that he has to say, I can't do this when I can't handle this when you are saying things like this. As long as there is that open communication, then any of those triggers or those eggshells or any of that will slowly go away.
Mm.
Again, I live in constant fear of everything.
Right.
So, I will always have that. I will always think, oh my God, is this going to be the day that he's going to drink? He don't really go anywhere because, I work mostly, I work all the time. But, you know, if he does go to like his brother's or something for poker night, I will instantly start thinking, oh, this is it. This is going to be it.
Right.
But then I remember that he has learned the tools that help him through his day.
Mm.
And if we do go anywhere together, if there's drinking or anything, we have, the code words and we have the looks. If either one of us are uncomfortable, then, we'll leave. But I don't think, I honestly, because it's just the way that I am, I don't think it'll ever completely go away. But as long as I know that I can talk to him about it now, then it's not as what's the word I'm looking for? It's not as in depth. That's not the word I'm looking for, but you know what I mean. It's not as deep.
Right. When you spoke of triggers, you made me think of also something that you learn to be aware of, at least I have in my case, I'm sure you have as well, which also requires communication, but you may have also just picked up on it through being married to your husband and going through this whole journey, which is what triggers him to drink. Just as like my father, I've learned certain places he can't go to without drinking first. Certain events will make him drink. Certain social situations, even certain just like daily things, and it's been hard to accept that because unfortunately it's the water park, the movie theater, the
It's
mall,
almost
pretty
everywhere
it
now.
becomes
Yeah.
almost everywhere eventually, but in the
Yeah.
beginning, I know as my father when he is sober, trying to avoid certain places or be more checking in on him at certain places because, like we said, it kind of becomes everywhere at some point. But when you regress back and become sober again, and then you're kind of, I feel like some of it goes away where it's not everywhere, but you still have big key situations to be aware of. So I think as much as the what kind of reminds you of those drinking days, also what will entice you into drinking again is so important to be aware of. And then as we wrap up here, what would be your main message to the loved ones of individuals, not just in recovery, but who are currently, addicted? What is some advice you could give them that really helped you through everything? We understand kind of why you stayed. This is more of the how did you stay to the effect of like what helped you through this, not just with your relationship with your husband and his addiction, but also just you as well, because obviously this was very damaging to you and your mental health and your well-being. And there were probably a lot of days you spend, maybe feeling, and for some people, it pushes them into addiction as well. So how did you combat all of this?
Yeah. So I too I drank a lot as well. I think when we first, and we've discussed this on numerous occasions, when we first started dating, we kind of fed off of each other.
Hmm.
I think it was the first relationship that we both had where our like the first year the drinking wasn't an issue because we just did it together. I The biggest difference between the two of us is that I did not have to drink to live. If or
Hmm.
when I stopped, or if I stopped, I was going to be fine. I was not going to die from not drinking. Whereas he got to the point where if he stopped, he would have just died if he just stopped. I did that for many, I guess maybe myself 10 to 15 years or so, every single night, that's how I coped. I too drank until I passed out. But it was only at night, and it was only after the kids went to bed, and he was usually already knocked out. So, I would sneak in and try to find his bottles that he tried to hide that, he wasn't a very smart alcoholic, I'm not going to lie to you. He put them all in the same places all the time.
Hmm.
So like I would drink his stuff. That was how I coped because I didn't know what else to do because I was hiding from everyone else
Right.
just how bad he really was. But at the same time, I was also getting to that point. I I could not go a single day mentally without it. It wasn't a physical thing, it was a mental thing. I guess the last year or two, I slowly started to I slowed down a little bit. I wasn't doing it every night. I would do it every couple of weeks or every couple of months. And then it got to the point where I was the one that was the nasty drunk. I was
Hmm.
the one that would, and I'm not a nasty person. I don't like to argue. I've had people say, how come you didn't just yell at him and scream at him? Because that's just not me. That's not who I am. But
Right.
apparently, drunk Alicia liked to do that. And I don't remember the last 2 years of, I obviously remember them as I was sober, but there were many occasions that I don't remember that I have to go off of what my alcoholic of a husband tells me that I was like. And, how do you believe that? Because you were also drinking. So that is honestly how I coped. That and a lot of prayer. I prayed harder than I think I had ever prayed in my entire life because, again, I didn't think that I thought I deserved it, but I knew deep down that I didn't deserve this. So when he went to rehab, they have a family weekend so the families can go, but it was during COVID. It was right before COVID, so I was the only one that could go. And
Oh,
I made the
okay.
promise to him that weekend that I too was going to stop, that I was not going to drink anymore. I was going to do this sober thing with him. Total difference between him and I. He's in recovery. He had to go through all of those things. I look at myself, I've had people say, no, you're in recovery too because you're going through it with him. But I am sober because I choose to be sober because I knew that if I kept going the way that I was going, because that was my only way of coping with dealing with his addiction, is that I was going to end up right there next to him. I was going to end up in rehab as well or worse. So I made that promise to him that, I was going to do it with him. So I too have been sober for a little over 5 years. And you mentioned something too earlier about, going places that might trigger your dad or whatever. I still, to this day, I'm the one that has a bigger issue going to some of these places. And I'm in the business that I'm in, I go to events all the time and, there's drinking all the time. And most of the time I
Right.
don't have an issue, but I have an issue with ones that are at nighttime because a lot of them are at bars or at clubs. And, I want to revert right back to how I was when I was 25 and I can't, but I can come home and I can have that discussion with him. So I think it's helped us mostly because I have chosen to do this with him, that when I am struggling or he is struggling with any place that we're at, we when it comes to that, we both legitimately understand what the other person is going through. But I can say, going back, I apologize. See, I told you I ramble a lot. Going back, I would tell people prayer is the biggest thing. It doesn't matter to me, in all honesty, what you believe in. Having that some sense of there's some type of higher power up there that may or may not be able to help me through this. That was sober Alicia's way of getting through everything. If I didn't have that, I don't know. I can't answer where we would have ended up. It was the one thing that was holding me together during the day, at least. It was the easiest thing that I could do because you can pray at any point. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
where you're at.
I think it ties into what you said one of the main issues w was, which you talked about, and I understand this because my mom too, when people had said, "Oh, your husband's an alcoholic," or "Don't marry say he's an alcoholic," she said no. She defended him, and for a long time she hid it because she was embarrassed, especially because they had said it up front. To admit that they were correct was even more embarrassing than just having a husband who became an alcoholic. So it was both layers of that. And so that kind of isolated her as it sounds like it isolated you where
It did.
you
Yeah.
didn't have anyone to talk to you about this. And if you did talk to them about it, it was kind of like a I told you so was the first part. Then was followed up
Yeah.
with not a lot of people who support you in wanting to stay. It's a lot of get out of there. There's this, you're
Yeah.
not thinking right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people need some kind of neutral third party to talk to, but not everyone wants to do therapy. Not everyone has friends or coworkers who want to indulge in their advice. So I think that's where the prayer comes in, even if it's seems one way at times, at least you're kind of expressing and getting some of it out. And maybe for some people it's journaling or,
Journal. I was gonna say.
artwork,
Yep.
I was going to say, some kind of
Yep.
form of where you feel
Yep.
like you're getting some of those emotions out. That's so important. But if you can even why I think like support groups for the loved ones of addicted individuals are important to have, and maybe it's a church community, maybe it's a nonprofit, maybe it's just like an online community, but having something where you meet up and get a talk about this, especially with people who understand, because there's a lot of people who they don't understand. I've tried talking to people and they just don't understand. They hear
Yeah.
alcoholic or addict and they have this preconceived notion of what that entails. And my father does a lot of things that normal addicts don't do, or not every addict is the same. And I
Yeah.
really get frustrated when people who have dealt with an addicted family member try to compare or put that addicted individual on the same level as my dad. Everyone's
Yep.
different. Just because your addicted loved one did XYZ doesn't mean mine's going to do XYZ. They might do ABC. So I think finding people who are open-minded and will communicate and most importantly listen is so important. And that's why I really appreciate you breaking the silence, a reference to your
Yeah.
husband's book on
Yeah.
addiction.
That's exactly
Having this
why we started
conversation that
it.
we're having.
Yeah, that's exactly why we started it. You look, if you would have met him 10 years ago, nobody would have ever known that he was an alcoholic and he was drinking 12 to 15 hours a day, depending on the day.
Wow.
Nobody would have ever guessed. He never lost his job. He had a car. We always had a roof over our heads, albeit most of that was because of me, but he didn't lose any of it. He didn't lose his family. We were still here. People have a preconceived notion that addicts, whatever they're addicted to, they are losers or they're homeless, they're on the
Right.
streets or
They got a
whatever.
brown
And
paper bag in their hand.
exactly, and that's not always the case. Most of us hide behind that. Most of us will put on the face for everyone else to think that everything's okay, and a lot of it is all with with what's inside, and that's what I think. I personally, I've seen all of it. I've seen both sides. I've seen the addicts that are out there, and they're, you can clearly tell that they are. I have friends that are in recovery that have been clean for 10 years from heroin or something like that, and I've heard their stories. those, you can kind of tell that they are. I think the ones that are hiding behind it, I think to me, those are the ones that are hurting more
Right.
because we don't want people to see us any differently. So the family members, like, your family and myself, hiding behind, the happy face, telling everybody, oh no, he's fine, there's nothing wrong. That's all, to me, that's almost just as mentally disabling as if I were to be going out there and being like, yes, my husband's an alcoholic. Yes, look at him.
Right.
It's I think that's why we created Breaking the Silence, because it's not just about the addict, it's about the family members. And so many of us hide, whether we're in the addiction or we're not, and we want to break that habit. We don't want people to hide anymore. So we created Breaking the Silence with that mindset of, this is for addicts. This is for people, that love an addict, whether they're in active recovery or not. This is for people with, mental health disorders. I myself, I have OCD and ADD and, anxiety, depression. I've got all of that stuff. So that's why we created this group is to make everybody realize that you are not alone and you don't have to hide anymore, no matter what the issue is. That's why we're here.
Right. And again, I thank you for coming on the show today to do
Yeah,
exactly that and
absolutely.
having this conversation with me. And
Absolutely.
I encourage anyone listening who feels like they're the loved one of an addict who just hasn't known where to go or to speak to. There are a lot of platforms out there for you to voice your story and your journey and to connect and help others. So definitely encourage you all to check that out, as well as to check out the previous episode with Damien Bloss, to check out his side of the story, hear about, those 20 years from his end,
Mm.
as well as look into his book, Breaking the Silence. Like we said, it's so important to have and host these conversations, and to be vulnerable and honest and, to
Mhm.
not hide behind shame and these feelings of wanting to look a certain way. I think it's so important to be vulnerable and honest. So thank you for coming on the show today and sharing your time to do just that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I truly do appreciate it. Like I said, not many people ever want to hear our side of it, so I really do appreciate you giving me this chance.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide, through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side, as one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.